Carpentier has spent nearly 50 years researching and writing about international relations based in India, New Delhi, and also has traveled to France and Europe during that period, accumulating his data on what is happening in world politics. During his time in India, he has studied extensively Vedic Indian texts and has a lot of information to share about ancient Vedic traditions concerning gods, hybrid beings, and ascended masters of wisdom, and how all that relates to extraterrestrial life and technology.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome, Kome, to Exopolitics Today. Great to have you back.
Very nice to see you again, Michael. It's not very frequently that we talk, but at least the podcast gives us an opportunity to reconnect.
Yes, these podcasts are a blessing in terms of being able to just have extensive talks with people all over the world without having to get on planes and buy hotels and accommodation and so forth. This is so much easier. So I'm glad we can talk. And you really have an extensive background of travel in terms of international politics and understanding ancient Vedic traditions. So, again, just remind my audience, what is it that drew you to India and to live in New Delhi to make that your kind of main base of operations over the last 50 years or so?
I was born in the Canary Islands and spent part of my earlier childhood in Spain and other countries as well. But my father was a philosopher and an Orientalist, and we shared a passion for the East. And as a teenager, I wanted to come to India and study various aspects of Indian traditions, philosophy, literature, culture, fine arts. So that's what we did. We traveled across Asia for more than a year by car, and then traveled all around India for 8 years. Then I went to live in the States and in some other countries, and came back here 20 years ago. So my main residence is in Delhi, even though I also spend time every year in Europe.
Okay, well, sometimes maybe I get confused between the city of Delhi and New Delhi. So New Delhi is the capital. So you're in the capital of India?
Yes, but remember, Delhi and New Delhi are the same city. It's just there are two different areas. The older city, the new city, and now, not so new anymore because it was built by the British in the early 20th century. And then now you have a number of satellite cities that have risen, so that you are looking at a megalopolis of over 20 million people.
Okay, well, that must be quite an experience. So in the ancient Indian traditions, the literature, it talks about these different gods, devas, asuras, and rakshasas. So are these kind of like mythical beings, or are we talking about real extraterrestrial beings?
Ancient traditions are always ambiguous to us because they tell us things that we choose to interpret as myth, which in the current understanding is considered essentially non-historic and partly imaginary, or at least highly metaphorical. But we can also interpret them more literally. I guess some people go overboard in both directions. Some people try to make it all absolutely historic and concrete and interpret it in our current terms, and others deny it all and say it's all fantasy. I think the truth lies not somewhere in between. The truth lies very clearly in an experience accumulated over many thousands of years, not only in India, but particularly in India, where it is very well recorded, of interactions with higher beings. And then it's up to us to establish the identity of those beings. I would like to say at the beginning that the Indian tradition can be broken broadly into three periods. The first is the Vedic proper, which is the time when the four Vedas and a number of literature, a number of books that are connected to the Vedas, such as the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, which are primarily devotional and ritual texts. And then come the Upanishads. So that you might consider as the first period. Then the second period is the period of the great epics. And that includes the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is the largest epic in the world because it has practically 1 million verses. And then, of course, apart from the Ramayana, which is supposed to be earlier than the Mahabharata. And then you come to the third period, which is broadly what we call in Western terms the medieval period, that is very rich in literature of all kinds, scientific, philosophical, poetic, theatrical. But throughout these three periods, you find a connection with higher beings and higher civilizations. In the Vedas, you hear about primarily 6 and later 7 great Rishi lineages. Rishis are the composers of the hymns of the Vedas. A rig or a risha is a hymn, and the Rishis were the authors. But the Rishis are very long dynasties, so they spread across the centuries, and you find them in various periods. They carry names that are hallmarks of Indian civilization, Angirasa and Kratu and Kashyapa, who apparently gave his name to the Caspian Sea, and so on and so forth. By the way, Angirasa the Angirasas are celestial beings whose name can be traced in our current concept and name of angel, because angel comes from angelos, which is angeros, and which angeras. So clearly you have a connection. Remember, we are all part of the so-called Indo-European civilization. So we share many of the same, not only the same figures, but also the same names with relatively small modifications. And all these rishis are known as the sons or the children of the spirit, of the mind. They are really manasaputras, which means they were not born on earth from earthly families, from human families. They came from somewhere else, and they are supposed to dwell in the Big Dipper. In fact, the 7 stars of the Big Dipper carry their names. And then, of course, before you go further, you probably need to give a little background on the Indian cosmology, because it's very extensive, beginning in the Vedas, where you hear about the eras, the yugas. But the Vedas were built probably around what we call the zodiacal year and the precession of the equinox, which is the great year, of 25,000 years. And the 25,000 years were divided into 2 parts, night and day, so 12,000 some years each. But that was probably the original Vedic time frame, which was subsequently expanded to vertiginous durations, because when you reach the so-called classical Indian culture, you hear about this succession of eras that are very, very long, which really encompass the age of the universe as we understand it today. You have a yuga, which is 4,320 million years, and some more, but I'm just rounding it up. And the yuga is a day of Brahma. Brahma is the creator god, and Brahma is supposed to live 100 years. And in these 100 years, there are days and nights. And our universe is one of his days, which lasts 4.3 billion years. And it's followed by a night of Brahma. So you have Brahmadinam or Brahmadya, followed by Brahmanisha. During the night of Brahma, after 4.2 billion years, everything goes to sleep. Everything goes dark. It's like a closing down, pralaya. But the seeds of everything remain. And then after one night, which lasts as long as a day, you get another day of Brahma, which is again 4 billion years. And then all the beings that were in a seed, from the stars to the planets, to the people, to the animals, to the plants, they are all reborn, possibly in different shapes, but they carry the same identity. It's as if it's a sort of a giant gene bank which is kept and then eventually used to recreate the universe. So these universes keep on going on and off, and they are divided into 14 manvantaras, and the manvantaras are divided into yugas, and the yugas are divided into 4 seasons, which go from the highest, the most prosperous, the most righteous, to the lowest, Kali Yuga. And we live currently in Kali Yuga, which is supposed to be an age of great misery, distress, violence, strife, and degeneration. And I think we can all see that every day, almost everywhere. So this is the basic framework. And the rishis keep coming back in every yuga to sort of perpetuate the tradition and teach the wisdom. So clearly we are looking at a theory of intervention by higher forces. And of course, the rishis are by no means the only creatures in the Vedas. There are in fact lots of them, and later in Hindu literature, which by the way propagated into Buddhism, because there is no real separation between the Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies. Buddhism evolved out of Hinduism and kept most of its cosmology, geography, and mythology, if you want to call it that way. So we really are talking about Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and so on civilization. So what happens then?
Kind of like,
yes, please.
Kind of get you to elaborate a little bit more here on this. The 7 ancient Rishi Kings, or these beings that come from the Big Dipper or associated with stars in the Big Dipper, which immediately raises the possibility that are these like extraterrestrial beings. And you mentioned that they are associated with the Golden Age. So that kind of matches the Sumerian traditions and the Egyptian traditions that talk about that at the very beginning you had the gods ruling over humanity, and then you had the demigods, and then you had humans, but it kind of like corresponded with a descent in terms of wisdom, like these ages. So what you're talking about seems to be this kind of pattern that just repeats itself indefinitely, that you have a golden age where these Rishi Kings, or these 7 rishis from the stars, come back and they play a role in taking humanity into this kind of golden age of wisdom, high technology, whatever. And then there's a kind of like a descent over the subsequent thousands and thousands of years into a kind of like fallen into the Iron Age, or the age of Kali, where things are corrupt, like what we've witnessed over the last couple of thousand years, and then the whole thing repeats.
Yes, that is pretty much the pattern, because what you see here is a principle of what we call entropy. Therefore, things start on a very high note and then gradually decay. And then you have the concept of rebirth, regeneration, which is part of the natural cycle. So the rishis are beings that are not regarded as devas or gods, nor as human. They are somewhere in between, because in the Indian thinking, humans are not inferior to gods. If you want to talk about devas and asuras, they may be in some way fallen gods, but they have capacities in them that even some of the devas do not have. Because just as you have a huge scale of time, I mean, if you look at some of the speculative descriptions in some of the Indian texts, you see that the universe in their view is 311 trillion years. It takes 311 trillion years to vanish and be replaced by another. So you can imagine the scales of magnitude. And what's very interesting is that in Sanskrit, they devise numbers of that size. They actually went all the way into trillions and quadrillions, which for any so-called primitive civilization seems quite useless, because we certainly don't have to deal with that unless we get into quantum computing and physics. So clearly there was a reason to develop those numbers, both in the infinitely large scale as well as in the infinitely small scale. But now I would like to talk about the gods themselves, what we call gods, what the Latins called Deus, Dei, and the Greeks called Theos, Theo, which basically is the Sanskrit Deva. Now, Devas are principles of light. They are light beings. But what's very interesting is that from the beginning, they had two names. They were called Devas, but they were also called Asuras. Asuras means the lords, the powerful ones. And if you look at Sumerian and Middle Eastern history, you will find that there is Ashur, Assyria, and Sur, which is Syria. So you can certainly see a connection because Surya means the sun. It's a bright one, so the sun is also called an Asura. But what is also very typical of the Indian system, philosophical and religious system, is that Devas and Asuras ended up being on opposing sides. And they fought each other, and they still do. And to my mind, that's a very interesting concept because it helps us clarify what may be happening with what we call extraterrestrials. In the sense that the explanations that are now being given, some say, oh, they are evil and they are really causing us trouble, and others say, no, they cannot be bad. They are all actually very well-meaning, and it's only us who are creating trouble. You have recently heard this from our friend Stephen Greer again. And yet, I think the Indian interpretation of cosmology and cosmogony is much more subtle, because it tells you that the Devas and the Asuras originally were probably no different from each other. They might even have been different names given to the same beings. However, the story goes in the Upanishads that the Devas and the Asuras separated because the Asuras became very full of themselves. And though they have the same passions that all beings have, because life is determined by passions, rag, they ended up pushing this passion so far that they became unfair, cruel, violent, and domineering. And there is a very interesting story in which the Asuras and the Devas go together to Prajapati, who is supposed to be the Lord of the universe, and they ask him some questions about the nature of reality and life. And Prajapati gives some answers that on the surface are rather literal. And yet the Asuras take them and go back and say, all right, we understood, and we are now going to enjoy life and use what you told us to gain more power. And the Devas instead kept asking questions until they got to the bottom of it. And they then realized that what Prajapati had originally responded was not really the ultimate truth. So you see the differences between the Devas who go to the bottom of things, and therefore they become enlightened, and the Asuras who just take the appearances and are happy with that. And as a result, the Devas and the Asuras kept fighting until the Asuras were essentially pushed down. They became the fallen angels, and they are still around, but they do all sorts of things that are not right, even though they are also capable of doing very good things. The Asuras are not all evil, and the Devas are not all good, but the Devas have a predominance of light, and the Asuras have a predominance of darkness. And if you want to push the analogies further, you see that the Devas were ruled originally by Vritra in the Rig Veda, and Vritra is a great snake. He's a reptilian being. And so the Asuras align with him, whereas the Devas were ruled by Indra, who is the lord of the sky, of thunder. He's the equivalent of Jupiter for the Romans. And then later he could probably be assimilated to the archangel Michael because he kills the dragon or the reptilian. He kills Vritra. So in that sense, Indra becomes a sort of a St. George figure, whereas the Asuras are ruled by, as I said, originally by Vritra, but when Vritra died, then they accepted as their leader Shukra. And who is Shukra? Shukra is the planet Venus. And how did the Romans call Venus? Lucifer. So you have here the Asuras as the followers of Lucifer, which technically makes them demons. Now, I wouldn't go into further historical developments because that would be very long, but if you look at Persian religion, which is supposed to have branched out of Vedic religion, although, of course, there is a big controversy because the Persians don't like to be told they come second. But still, the likelihood is that there was a breakaway, and the Persians under Zoroastrian religion worshipped the Asuras, whom they called Ahuras. Ahura Mazda is their chief lord, while the Indians remained faithful to the Devas and rejected the Asuras. So you see here a very interesting scenario for a cosmic struggle, which is still going on. And when you, of course, to us who are, brought up in the monotheistic creed, we are told about God and the devil, but we still believe that God should prevail and the devil has no business being around. But yet in the Indian philosophical tradition, they tell you that the struggle between light and darkness is very much an essential part of creation. Life would not exist if it were not so. Therefore, you have to accept the asuras because they are there and they are going to keep fighting because that's part of the creation. If that stops, then all of creation disappears. And that, by the way, was a very ancient Greek belief as well. You know, Heraclitus of Ephesus said that the nature of the universe is struggle. And if the struggle ends, the universe also switches off.
So in a way, wouldn't this kind of struggle between the asuras and the devas be reflective of what today in modern literature you have a lot of contactees talking about this struggle between different galactic organizations such as the Galactic Federation of Worlds or the Andromeda Council against the Orion Empire, the Draconian Empire, where on the one side you have the freedom-loving beings that support kind of like liberty, free expression, creativity, and on the other hand you have these beings that support centralized authority. And in a way, you know, this pattern repeats itself in history. You know, you had the ancient struggles you just mentioned between, say, Vedic India and which was, I guess, much more decentralized, freedom-loving, and the Persians, who have always been kind of like centralized and monolithic, and certainly the ancient Greeks perceived the Persians in that way. So yeah, and even today you have it with China being very much this kind of centralized monolithic power, and then you have like the freedom-loving peoples of, say, Europe, North America, and say India.
Yes, I think that's a very good analogy, and it's part of human nature. We are always oscillating between control and I would not say anarchy, but will for freedom, the wish for liberation. So a balance has to be found. And you know, the creative myth of Hinduism is the churning of the ocean of milk, which is done by the Vedas and Asuras, pulling in two opposite directions with a great snake that is used as a churning instrument. And eventually all the treasures come out of the sea of milk, and the Asuras are defeated because they refuse to partake in the sura, which is the divine brew, the divine drink, you know, what the Celts call the divine potion. And the Asura, by refusing that, essentially refuses communion. So you find a trace of that in Christian liturgy, in which to be a Christian you have to share in the bread and wine, particularly in the wine. So you see there, you see the root of all the great religions, and how there is a differentiation between those who take the path of power, the so-called left-hand path, and those who take the path of communion, the right-hand path.
So I want to kind of move on now to that kind of second period in Indian tradition. You mentioned the Upanishads and the Mahabharata, because in there it describes this kind of like really major war that happened there on the Indian subcontinent. And it talks about kind of like all these advanced kind of weapons that are used by the different sides. So, you know, again, is this just kind of mythological descriptions, or are we talking about advanced technologies that were used by the competing sides or factions in the Mahabharata?
There seems to have been some experience of very powerful weapons that were clearly not hand weapons of a traditional, you might say, primitive civilization. Well, these were memories of some events that were witnessed at some time, or whether there were indeed relationships between humans and devas and asuras or rakshasas, who are another class of beings. Remember, these beings are supposed to live up in the sky. And as far as you go, you will find them. The whole universe is populated with them. All the way to the sun, there is a particular space which is the world that's immediately above ours, and that is populated by certain classes of beings. Then if you go up away from the sun, that is outside the solar system, basically, then you are going all the way to the pole star, Dhruv in Sanskrit, and there you find another class of beings. And then you go beyond the pole star, which probably means you exit the galaxy, and you find still other kinds of beings. So the beings are there at all levels. And the scale of space is as large as the scale of time, because the Indians understood that space and time are not separated. And in a state of illumination, samyama, you understand them both as one, which is what physics is driving at. You know, physics is coming to the same conclusion. So in the end, the structure of the Hindu universe is Maya, which is an illusion, if you want to call it that way. It is actually a sort of a screen. It's a virtual reality, which is projected by the great consciousness, that is Brahman. And Brahman is not Brahma. Brahma is a personalized figure who is a creator. But Brahman is what lies behind Brahma, which is completely impersonal, indescriptible, and therefore above life and death, above space and time. And today, if you hear the leading analysts of consciousness, such as Donald Hoffman, they tell you that space and time are mainly an interface. There is something behind it, which is consciousness. And that's why if you try to understand the universe as space-time, you fail. And that's what the new telescope, the James Webb telescope, is telling us. You know, it's very interesting now if you follow the accounts that are given about the discoveries made by the James Webb Space Telescope, you realize that most of what we thought was true until a few years ago is actually probably to be completely revised, such as, for example, the Big Bang. We don't even know if the Big Bang really took place, but if it took place, it didn't take place the way we think, because you know, we find, as far as we go, we find galaxies that are fully mature, which, by the way, and which are also very young, which means that, you know, they couldn't be so far if they were born with the Big Bang and still be young. So the whole scale of time is changing. And this is something which, to a Hindu, is a completely natural discovery, because it actually vindicates what is said in some of the scriptures. Now, back to what the Upanishads say, because you mentioned the Upanishads, we are told that the human being is made of 3 bodies and 5 sheaths or envelopes. And these sheaths are going from the lower, which is the physical body, which is made of food. It's made of what we eat. And you go above that all the way into the Anandamaya Kosha, which is the supreme, eternal, blissful body. But what's very interesting is that these bodies can only perceive and interact what is at their own level. The higher level can perceive the lower one, but the lower one cannot perceive the higher level. So our physical body cannot perceive metaphysical or psychic realities unless we particularly train for that. And that's why in our physics, in our astronomy, we are not going beyond perceptions of material objects, which are actually made visible to us by a computerized process. For example, what we see with the space telescope is mostly in the infrared range, which means we wouldn't see it. But then what we do is that once we get the images, or rather the vibrations, the radiations back, we translate them into visible objects. So you see, we are not seeing things as such. We are seeing representations that our minds need, because our minds process through the senses, primarily through sight. So you see how much our understanding of the universe is superficial. And that's why when the Indian astronomy tells you that planets, for example, are living beings, we laugh, because we say planets are not living beings, they are, you know, rocks rotating around the sun, revolving rather around the sun and rotating. But yet, if you look at the higher perception, then planets are also at a higher level, they are living beings. And that's why they are given a personality, they are given a history, and they are given thoughts, you know, and that is for us completely alien to our scientific thinking, because our scientific thinking proceeds from the fact that whatever we cannot quantify after perceiving it and proving it is not true, doesn't exist. But back to the Mahabharata, there are, of course, these great fights. And what's very interesting is that even before the fight begins, before the great battle begins, you have a series of chapters that tells you about how the universe operates and how there are the great gods, the primary gods, Varuna, Kubera, Indra, Soma, Surya, and how these gods live in huge palaces, which are hundreds of miles long. And these palaces float in the ether. And those gods live there in splendor and comfort, and they have with them many other gods and goddesses, and they have with them the beings who lived in previous eras and who have gone up there because of their meritorious deeds. So you have a vision of sort of paradise, which collects all the good souls, and they live there, probably waiting to come back, or some of them will never come back. But anyway, the fact is that these big astral palaces are seen as the dwellings of the gods, and they are described in great detail. And when you think of what is being seen for many decades, you realize that these great shining craft that fly around, and some of them are supposed to be hundreds of miles long if you go into outer space, then you see that there is a very good match with what is described in the Mahabharata, in a particular chapter which is called the Sabha Parva. And Sabha, by the way, means a chamber, and we have kept the root in our word for supper, because it's a place where the gods assemble to have supper, which is, of course, what you find in Greece with the Olympians who sit around the table and enjoy nectar and ambrosia. So the tradition of the gods having a supper in a great palace somewhere up in the sky is very vivid in many different cultural and spiritual traditions.
Yeah, that's very important there, that there's a connection between these floating palaces or flying cities that are described in the Mahabharata with these motherships, or these huge extraterrestrial craft that are supposedly arriving here, that have been here associated with some of these different organizations that apparently have recently arrived. So it's very interesting, when you when you earlier said that this restoration of a golden age is when the kind of the rishis return. We can assume that when these ships return, these flying cities or floating palaces return, that's the beginning of a golden age. And I know that there's been a number of people that I've been interviewing recently that have talked about these huge motherships that have recently arrived in our solar system, that are here to watch over our transformation from a kind of insular planet into this kind of galactic society. So I mean, is that kind of like, it sounds like that's very consistent with what the Vedas have described happening many tens of thousands of years ago.
Yes, and also you could relate it to the concept of the avatar, which has become very popular because of some films and also now the computer games and others, virtual reality. But avatarana means in Sanskrit, the descent. And avatars are beings who have descended and taken a human form to play a role in the world. And the great gods don't come in their original form, and maybe they don't have one, but they come in a human form, and they become leaders, prophets, guides, such as Sri Krishna and Lord Rama, Sri Rama, and the 10 great avatars of the Indian philosophical tradition, which in many cases includes the Buddha. So you see the fact that those great beings come and embody. This concept was used in the Star Wars, well, not so much in Star Wars, but in Star Trek, when you have the beaming down and beaming up, so the appearance of people who come from another world. And I think that's what you can see in so many traditions, but in India, it's particularly well documented. And it establishes the connection between the human reality and the divine reality. And I think this is where Christianity began, or it maybe didn't begin that way, but eventually when it was, you might say, taken over by the Greeks, they definitely conceived this image of the Son of God coming down and taking a human form and then being baptized. And there are several paintings from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries which show a beam of light coming down from a flying craft, showed the experience that some of those painters might have had. But the fact is that Jesus becomes the Christ because he's the Son of God. And this is a completely foreign concept to the Jewish tradition. That's why the Jews were so alien to it, because they could not understand how God could possibly be associated with a human being. It was sheer blasphemy. But in the Greco-Indo-European context, yes, then you have the image of the Son of God. The problem is that, I'm not saying it's a problem, but it has become one because they said that's the only one and there is no other. Therefore, all the other religions are false, unless they announce him, because he's the only personality who essentially came down from God himself. And that in itself is a limitation, which creates a chasm between Christianity and ancient traditions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and you might mention many others, whether it's Native Americans, the Australians, you Africans, you can find them all over the world.
So I wanted to ask about this Kalki, prophecies of the return of Kalki as the 10th and final incarnation of Vishnu. So are we talking about a god, or is this a very highly evolved extraterrestrial that is returning, presumably on one of these kind of floating palaces or these extraterrestrial motherships that have recently arrived in our solar system?
Kalki probably is a fairly late tradition. We don't know when exactly it originated. It seems to be tied to the concept of a struggle of liberation, and it became particularly popular when the first Muslim invaders arrived in the subcontinent, because there was that sense that a liberator was expected to save Hinduism, just like the Buddhists expected Maitreya to also protect them. And as a result, you have now this very vivid image of Kalki, who comes on a horse, generally a white horse, and who is a very fierce, benevolent but fierce incarnation of Vishnu, supposedly the 10th, the last, and therefore the most evolved, because the avatars of Vishnu also follow what you might call the law of evolution, because the first one is actually a fish, and it goes on rising in the scale of evolution until you get to the divine man, who is Sri Krishna. And before that, you have the ideal king, who is Sri Rama. And then you have the Buddha in some of the traditions. And then you finally have Kalki. So that is an image which is certainly symbolic. It meets the last of the 4 knights of the apocalypse, the knight who rides a white charger and who is dressed in a purple cloth. And so there is certainly a connection there between several apocalyptic traditions. You also find it in Islam, by the way. The same thing is evoked by many Islamic esoteric traditions. So I would assume that Kalki could indeed be a figure of that liberating image, that liberating archetype. But the interesting part is that you see, in all of the Indian philosophical and traditional system, there is no sense of a sort of a elimination of all evil, because evil, as we call it, is actually a subjective perception. For example, some of the most evil-doing creatures in the Indian stories, traditions are the Rakshasas. And Raksha means protector. So the Rakshasas are also protectors if you know how to relate to them. But of course, if you are caught up in your passions of fear, greed, ignorance, and the rest, the Rakshasas can be very deadly because they are fierce creatures. They are like lions or tigers, they will go for whatever they can eat. And therefore, if you rise to a higher level, then you are able to master all this, and eventually that's what you find in another very, very essential text of the Indian tradition, which is the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. And I wrote some papers on the Patanjali Yoga Sutra and its analogies with some of the contemporary discoveries of science and technologies, because the Patanjali Yoga Sutra talks about how to master all the laws of nature, how to make yourself infinitesimally small, how to make yourself as large as the solar system, how to transform matter in any way you want, how to free yourself from all limitations, and how to know what people think, how to move things at a distance by the pure force of the mind. All those things are given with very precise descriptions. So this is not just imagination. It is a report on things that were well known. And of course, in today's age, we can't make much sense of it, but there is a series of studies, including one which was commissioned by the ATIP, the ATIP that was started by Harry Reid with the collaboration of the Bigelow Research Foundation and the EarthTech organization of Targ and Russell Targ and Harry Putter. And they came up with 25 papers, which are part of what DIERD, Defense Intelligence Reference Document. And these documents, which are essentially were funded by the DIA and the DARPA, show you what studies are being made about hyperluminal speed of travel, about gravitational communications, which are faster than light, about how to transcend matter, how to make matter programmable, all those things which are supposed to be part of the technology of aliens, is something which is being very actively researched, but which has been largely hidden from view. And it's only because of the efforts of certain people that these documents have actually come out. Some of them were authored by Dr. Eric Davis, and others by a number of other researchers in the US, in Canada, in Britain. So you see, there is a lot to look at here, because we are looking at the possible verification in recent years of what was discussed in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, and that is just one of the texts. Then if you look at the so-called kathas, which are the great stories, the great tales of Indian mythology, if you want to call it that way, they are generally seen as medieval texts, but they probably contain stories that are much older. And a lot of those stories were picked up in the 1001 Nights, in the Arabian Nights, which came later, of course, were written later. But then if you look at the great kathas, many of them deal with a mythical king, who was not so mythical, by the way, called Vikramaditya. And Vikramaditya, who ruled in central India, maybe 2000 years ago, was supposed to have mastered with his court, which was full of scientists and engineers. He was supposed to have mastered a number of technologies. He had robots, he had dancing girls, which were mechanically made. He had bees that were actually what we now call drones, that flew around and performed services and brought honey, but they were manufactured. And he had all those guards, were giant guards, who were again made in a workshop, and which were controlled by thought, by essentially remote action. So all these things are there, and they are explained, and they were for the entertainment of people, but they certainly reflected some reality. So much so that in the 10th century of our era, 1000 AD, you had another king called Bhoja of Dhara in central India. I have been to his capital, and he was also an extremely gifted king. He wrote a number of books, and he had a court made up of a number of very brilliant people, astronomers, engineers, philosophers, mathematicians. And he wrote in particular an encyclopedia. He probably didn't write it alone. It was a collective work, which is called the Samarangana Sutradhara, which is primarily dedicated to architecture, how to build palaces, how to build temples, how to build cities. But there is a chapter which deals with robots and artificial beings, and then flying craft. And he says, I will not get into great detail because this is best kept secret. But you can build flying craft like the craft flown by the Devas and Asuras and other beings, and they can go to other stars. And he then goes on into some description, but there are texts that are much more precise and which give you 80 different shapes of so-called vimanas. And the vimanas are the flying craft which were flown by the gods, but which also were built by humans, because the humans were taught how to build them by the gods, by the Rakshasas, by the Asuras. And so the technology transfer was already there at some point, and then it looked like it stopped, But in India, they kept the memory of that right into the beginning of what we call the modern age in the West. I mean, right until the 16th century.
Well, that's very important. Those texts, those Vedic references to these ancient flying craft and how to build those. So I want to kind of bring up something that's foundational in the Hebrew Christian traditions, which is Noah's Ark, which of course is described as just a wooden boat designed to save a lot of people and animals during a time of catastrophe. But given what you just said, I would say that that was probably very likely a kind of spacecraft that was built for the purpose of saving people, like an ark that wasn't a wooden ark, that it was actually some advanced flying craft, like a space ark, if you like. And so what you just referenced in those ancient Vedic traditions of building these craft, I wonder if in the Vedic tradition, there is also references to some kind of Noah's Ark that was built, and whether that could have been like a flying craft or a space ark to save a lot of people during a time of great cataclysm. So is there such a story in Vedic tradition?
Yes, there is. The Vedas make some brief references to it, but you find a much more elaborate story in the Puranas. The Puranas are a huge collection of texts. There used to be many more, probably quite a few were lost, but what remains, although there are a lot of repetitions, it still encompasses about 400,000 verses. And in some of the Puranas, you are told about the ark that was built by Manu. Manu was the first man, who, in order to avoid perishing in the flood. So Manu did what Noah was said to do in the biblical tradition. He built a huge vessel. We're not quite sure what it was made of. And he let it float over the waters until he was given the signal that the water would recede. And then he was guided to a peak in the Himalayas, which is supposed to be the Kailash mountain, and they say Sumeru, which is an undefined peak. But he was essentially guided there by a giant fish called the Matsya. Matsya means fish, and that was apparently a toothfish because it had a huge, protruding tooth. It was basically a unicorn, and that fish pulled the ship, all the way to that peak and tied it up there so that the fish was safe and stopped floating and became set. And then when the water level went down, then Manu and all his family came down and resettled the plains of India. Now, Manu is the original man, in fact, the name man comes from Manu, and the ancient Germans, before they became Christians, had said that their grandfather was Manu, and therefore they shared the Vedic tradition. And Manu is then the father of all this civilization. But it's very interesting that the story of the Ark is there, and it is in India, it's in the Himalayas. In the Middle East, of course, it's Mount Ararat. And you find it among the Sumerians and the various Semitic people. So clearly this story has traveled. We don't quite know where it originated, but it does look like the Vedic story is probably the oldest, because we don't have evidence of such an old text in the Bible itself. So clearly the Hebrews must have borrowed it from the Sumerians through the Chaldeans. And we don't know between the Middle East and India where the initial story was given, but there is possibly a common tradition because they all experience the same thing.
So, I mean, we've been talking about the Devas, the Rakshasas, the Asuras as connected to these kind of off-world extraterrestrial beings with advanced technologies and tremendous power. I know that India is also associated with these masters of wisdom or ascended masters who are pretty much like indigenous humans that are just very highly evolved in consciousness and have these cities or these incredible psychic powers. So, yeah, what do you know about those ascended master traditions? I know there was the book series Baird Spalding's The Masters of the Far East. So, these ascended masters of wisdom, how far back does that go? Are they associated with the Rishi Kings as well in some way? So, yeah, can you speak to that?
The Siddhas are the individuals who ascended to a very high level because of their intense tapasia. Tapasia is asceticism, austerity, connected or combined with study of the esoteric text. So the tapasia is what enables the mind and the body to acquire enormous powers and transcendental abilities. Tapas has given taping, or there are a lot of words associated with it, to tap, for example. It's connected to that because there is an essence of pain in tapasya. I mean, the Hindu tradition believes that in order to surpass yourself, you must go through a process of pain, which eventually eliminates the sense of pain, but you must go through it. There is a trial, which is a very common thing in religion. If you don't go through trials, you will not go anywhere because comfort is a very stultifying thing. It basically brings you down. So in order to get rid of it, you have to go through tapasya. The Buddha did it before he became a Buddha. So the fact is that these ascended masters have enormous powers. And of course, the great rishis are siddhas as well, because they could do almost anything. Vishwamitra, Vashishta, and all of them. But of course, with the advent of other religions, such as Jainism and Buddhism, Buddhism has the various Buddhas and Jainism has the various Tirthankaras. So these are all ascended masters, and you find ascended masters in all eras, in all periods of Indian history, all the way down to our century. One of the best known ones is, of course, Ramana Maharshi, who passed away in the 1950s, and Sri Aurobindo, who passed away in 1947, I believe. Then, of course, there are some others who may or may not be regarded as ascended masters, such as Swami Vivekananda. But definitely his teacher, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, is seen as an ascended master. So that's a continuous tradition. It has never ended because, unlike other religions, Hinduism doesn't set any kind of limit and say, well, now this is no longer possible because now we cannot have such great masters. Now they are all in the past. In the Hindu tradition, this goes on for as long as there is life. And therefore, the ascended masters are there, and we can choose the one that we particularly relate to, that we feel can really guide us the best, whether he's already passed on or whether he's still with us in the flesh. And that's the reason why there are so many great gurus who are carrying on with this tradition and who have a lot of followers. Now, some of them may disappoint us, and others, perhaps not the better known ones, are real spiritual teachers. But the fact is that humans all have the ability to go there, provided their karma is strong enough, and provided they have been able to go through the various stages. As I said, rising in the scale of consciousness. I mean, going all the way to the supreme consciousness, which gets rid of the limitations of time, space, the mind, and physical things. But what's very interesting is that if you are on this path, you will be tempted by some of the creatures who are technologically above you, but who don't necessarily want you to go much higher. And they will try to give you the powers that you may be tempted by, in the sense that, just like Christ was taken by Satan or Lucifer to the desert and given this temptation that you can get all the kingdoms of the world and throw yourself from that peak. And every time Jesus said, "Vaderetro Satanas," I will not go through this because I'm looking for something higher. I don't want to be a king. Likewise, the Buddha was told by his father, "You will be the king of the greatest and most powerful empire." And the Buddha said, "No, that's not what I want. I want to achieve liberation and give liberation to human beings and to all beings." So you see, this is the problem with people who probably become a bit too addicted to the extraterrestrial vision of an infinitely powerful technological civilization in which people could live very long lives and could not know any kind of illness and have unlimited wealth. Now, these things are always possible because, again, to go back to the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, you are told about many powers that you can acquire through the practices that are taught in the Samkhya Yoga tradition and by other traditions too, like Tantra. But the fact is that if you get involved with the powers, then you are not getting to a higher plane. And that's why a choice has to be made at some point. Do you want to be just a magician? And then you can do a lot of things, but eventually you will also suffer consequences. Or do you want to go higher than that and you are not willing to get engaged in this very tempting but very dangerous pursuit of extrasensorial and superhuman powers?
I wanted to bring up the idea now of some of these ancient flying technologies, whether we're talking spacecraft or portals, space-time portals, being kind of hidden in different repositories. Now, we know it's a fact that Nazi Germany did send several expeditions all around the world looking for these ancient technologies because they thought that would be something that would help them in their kind of imperial quests for world domination. So some of these, they sent an expedition, whether it was one or two, to the Himalayas, yeah. and there have been kind of others that have talked about these halls of records found in places like Mount Kailash. I know Lobsang Rampa, very controversial, but he said there was a hall of records in Mount Kailash. More recently, there's a witness that I've been working with, Jean-Charles Moyen, who says that recently he was physically taken to Mount Kailash and saw this ancient hall of records there with incredible technology. So, are there these repositories of ancient technologies that are hidden in places like Mount Kailash or elsewhere in India?
Madame Blavatsky was perhaps was one of the first writers to extensively refer to those, at least in the West, refer to those halls of records. And she gave fairly precise accounts of the text she saw there, including the famous stanzas of Dzyan. She said that they were only available in the Akashic field. And the Akashic field is essentially the ethereal field. So there is probably no way to get there just physically and see them on paper or on manuscript or on parchment. I think there has to be a higher level of perception, as Aldous Huxley would write, the doors of perception. Otherwise, I think we fall into the trap of trying to find something which may not be there in the way we expect, and then we essentially get discredited by people who say, come on, this is all mythology, it has no reality. However, I can tell you that there has been a great deal of investigations in certain monasteries in Tibet, both in Chinese Tibet and in Indian Tibet, Ladakh. And some of those documents have not yet been analyzed, at least not publicly. And even in India, there are several million manuscripts that have never been translated and probably not even been read, except by very few people who keep their secret. So the availability of knowledge in so many places is not to be disputed. But the question is to find it. For example, I give you the example of the Vaimanika Shastras or Vaimanika Sutras. There are quite a few texts which talk about spacecraft and how to build them. And there was even a scientific body in India a few years ago, there was a team that undertook to analyze a particular text, which was part of a collection, the Prasthanatrayi. And in that text, they talked about how to build a Vimana and how to power it with mercury. And they talked about a particular composition, which they said would be the fuel for that Vimana. And we don't know what the age of that text was, but it was pretty old. Because, these texts have been copied along the centuries. So even if the text itself is from the 19th century, it's very often, most of the time, it is a copy of something much, much older. And the particular, composition was called Chumbak Mani. And when these scientists analyzed it and tried to reconstitute it, they found that it did indeed have properties that could enable it to propel a vehicle. So there was some base. It wasn't just all invention. Now, of course, what you hear if you read some of the if you read some of the scholarly views on the Vaimanika Shastras, they tell you, oh, these texts are just apocryphal, which, by the way, doesn't mean very much. They were written in the late 19th century or early 20th century because Indians got impressed with the first aircraft that were beginning to fly, and so they wanted to show they had done something too. And that was all an attempt to show that they had some technology of their own. But, this is very unsatisfactory because there are texts that are lying in some of the libraries that are actually at least 150 years old, but they refer to much larger literature, which is a lot older. It's like saying that because some of the texts we found of Patanjali Yoga Sutras are only from the 18th century, that means Patanjali lived in the 18th century. Obviously, that's not true. Patanjali lived at least 2,000 years ago, maybe 1,600 years ago, but he himself was referring to a lot of previous texts. Those people were not novelists writing in isolation about something that they had just thought of. It was a tradition that they were recapitulating and summarizing, but they refer to much, much older writings.
I want to talk now about the ancient Vedic texts describing these kind of hybrids, the children of the gods, the sons of the gods. Were these just, were these like genetic experiments? Were these sons of gods a kind of a creation of some kind of mixture of human and extraterrestrial DNA? Some of the top warriors like Arjuna and Karna, I think they were sons of the sun god, and so they were kind of like, they had these incredible powers that equipped them to be great warriors or super soldiers, we would call them today. So were the ancient extraterrestrials or the gods creating these hybrids for some of them to become what we would call today super soldiers?
It's possible. As I said, you cannot easily convince skeptics because they will tell you don't have physical proof, which obviously you don't have. So the interpretation is always up to you. In France in the 19th century, we had a great anthropologist, sociologist called Lévi-Brühl, and he wrote this book saying he entitled it The Primitive Mind. And he said, the primitive mind invents things that don't exist. I mean, the primitive mind, in his view, was so subjective that it would just invent things and claim they existed when in fact they weren't there. Now, that's a very 19th century rationalistic interpretation. Now we probably know better, or at least we should know better. And we shouldn't assume that people just made things up on the basis of stories. By the way, when you talk about tales, nowadays it tends to have a rather pejorative significance. A tale, T-A-L-E, is seen to be something that's just, who wrote a tale told by an idiot. Shakespeare, I think. So anyway, the fact is that a tale is related etymologically to the tala, and tala in Sanskrit means a rhythm, but it also means a plane, which means that if you're looking at different planes, you cannot know other planes from one particular plane. Therefore, trying to interpret everything from on the basis of what you can see and feel on this plane is just plain wrong. It's not going to get you the reality. And that's where the limitations of modern science lie. We are left brain oriented. By the way, there was a very interesting study that was published by the Stargate research group. Stargate research group in 1983 published a 29-page report showing that all the supernatural, so-called supernatural powers were actually accessible through certain techniques involving meditation and involving certain sound vibrations. This was related to Robert Monroe's Institute, and it was related to the work done by Itzhak Bentov, who was an Israeli yoga and parapsychology experimenter. So all that was published. It wasn't published because it was confidential, and eventually it was released through a Freedom of Information Act in 2003, I think. The fact is that they showed that the experiments and the research done in the framework of the Stargate project, which, as you know, was sponsored by the CIA, it actually confirmed a lot of the teachings of ancient Indian philosophy and metaphysics. It eventually confirmed that at the base, at the fount of the universe, there is something that they call the Tor, or the spiral of creation, which is like a sort of an engine for all that exists, and which is completely a reflection of the ultimate reality, and which is something that in ancient Indian texts they call Hiranyagarbha, the golden egg. The Hiranyagarbha is the golden egg from which all creation emerges. And they even called it an egg in that text brought out by the Stargate project. So you can see the complementarity between some of the modern research, which was mostly classified because it's all military. You know, they always try to find things that they can use for military purposes, but still they sometimes get a breakthrough into something which is what you might call purely spiritual, you know, metaphysical, which is no longer about the powers, but which is about realization. But anyway, this is slight divergence from what you were talking about. The fact is that there are beings which are known to be hybrid between gods and humans, and that's why they are in Greek they have the Emetheos, you know, the half god, demigod. In Sanskrit they are not called as such demigods, but they are not devas. They are just beings who have a divine origin, partly divine origin. They are, as they say, some beings are born of males and females, and some beings are not born of males and females. They are born spontaneously. They originate out of pure spirit. And that shows the difference between certain beings and others. And then there are beings who are born in a woman's womb, but they are essentially created by a higher spirit. This is what you find in the Greek demigod myth, and this is what you find even in the Christian tradition, that Jesus was not born of his father. He was born from something else. Now, this is something that in India is, I would say, fairly common, and you are right about the 5 Pandava brothers. Each of them was the son of a different god. They had the same mother, but they had a different god as their father, and each of them reflected the qualities of that god. For example, Bhima was a giant, and he had incredible strength because his father was Vayu, the god of wind, and the wind is the strongest thing, you know. And the same, you can say the same about the other Pandavas. Each of them had a particular quality, which had to do with his paternal origin.
I remember seeing a newspaper article about India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi claiming that Kana, one of these kind of mythological figures, was the world's first genetically engineered super soldier. So, I mean, that seems to be his belief. Now, I wonder whether that's just, him being a kind of a devotee of Indian classics, or whether he is knowledgeable about the extent to which these super soldiers can be genetically engineered. And so, the question is, does India have classified programs studying these ancient traditions, looking at the possibility of creating genetically modified super soldiers?
To my knowledge, that is not the case. The Prime Minister is definitely a strong believer in the Indian tradition, unlike many of his predecessors, particularly Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a very Western-trained skeptic and who felt that a lot of the Indian tradition was just nonsensical and should be replaced by modern science. And he kept saying we need to have a scientific temper and we cannot be mythological because we will keep the country down and backward. Now, the current government professes a strong belief in the authenticity of the Indian tradition, including its technological and scientific underpinnings. And that, of course, got the Prime Minister himself into some trouble, both at home and abroad, because people said he was just bringing India back to the Dark Ages, and he was discrediting modern science. And let's face it, a number of scientists who are interested in these topics in India, they cannot often say it publicly. They might have their private beliefs, but they could lose their careers or at least become butts of jokes if they were to actually speak out in that way. Because clearly in science, if you can prove something, then you are not taken seriously. And especially if you say things which appear to be completely at variance with what the modern history of mankind teaches. Clearly, the moment you challenge contemporary science and say that there may have been a more advanced science in the past, then you are, challenging the theory of evolution and the superiority of modern Western civilization, and therefore you make very bitter enemies, and they will really run you down because they do not want to have that kind of theory being publicized. But this being said, I believe that at least with regard to yoga and the various paranormal techniques that are taught in some of the Indian traditions, there are certain departments of military research, such as, for example, in the DRDO, which is a Defense Research and Development Organization, the national body which sits in New Delhi and has many scientists, probably hundreds and thousands of scientists and engineers. They would and they have worked on some of those possibilities with regard to food, with regard to breathing, with regard to yoga. To give you a very humble example, they have shown how yoga can be used to acclimatize soldiers to life and war at a height of 15,000 feet, which very few people can do. At 15,000 feet, you are going to be generally very unwell, or at least very frail. And many of the Indian soldiers who are up there on the Himalayan frontier come from every part of India. So they are not mountaineers. They have to be trained. So yoga is what is used to make them high altitude fighters. Of course, that's a very simple technique because it involves primarily breathing and certain exercise and meditation, concentration. It doesn't go into higher technologies. But I believe there are certain initiatives that are taken, but naturally they are limited by the very framework of the scientific establishment, which is generally very similar to what you find everywhere in the world, which means that if you step out of the orthodox path, you are immediately derided and you have problems with your funding, and so there are limits. But my view is that the evolution that is taking place will make India more and more willing to explore its own traditional knowledge.
Well, this is very interesting because it takes us from this kind of like open scientific literature, which you mentioned is very skeptical of all of this material. But then when you get into whistleblowers or insiders who come forward to talk about the classified programs, they say that the classified programs, the scientists in there are very, very interested in all of the literature and the ancient artifacts found all over the world, because they believe that this can give them some kind of insight or qualitative edge in understanding even more sophisticated technologies that are gained off world or whatever. So, that kind of makes me ask whether or not within India at the moment, you have a lot of their top scientists who maybe are kind of read into these programs, being involved in really trying to find and research and reverse engineer these technologies for an Indian space program or a secret Indian space program, which is entirely separate to their public space program. What is it? The Indian Space Research Organization that has sent craft to the moon and to Mars. That, in addition to that, you have a secret Indian space program. So is there an Indian secret space program kind of like very interested in all of these ancient technologies and their viability?
There might be one, but I'm not aware of it. And I suppose it is quite small because India has been traditionally more focused on developing some conventional abilities, such as flying satellites and launching them, and then creating on that base a number of services and, for the vast majority of the people. Obviously, there is a military space program, which is growing quite fast. And I do not know how much of it is indigenous and how much of it is relying on borrowed or licensed foreign technologies. Obviously, there is indigenous work that's being carried out, but it's very difficult to evaluate. As I said, many of the scientists were trained in a very orthodox way, and I would assume that unfortunately, some of the best prepared and trained scientists who went to study in the big technical centers abroad, whether it's MIT or Caltech or Princeton and these other great centers of knowledge, very often they are working there. As you know, a lot of Western science is now manned by Indians. So many of these Indians are doing very, very pioneering work, but they are living there and working there because very often it's very difficult to find a well-paid job in India in this field. So they get a lot of facilities in the West. Let's face it, a lot of the leadership of Western nations is based on the ability to buy talents everywhere. And that's what keeps America on the cusp of many fields of technology. So clearly, India would be much more advanced if many of its overseas citizens could come back and collaborate with indigenous research. But then again, until now, the budgets were not so large. So it was difficult because of the priorities that are usually adopted in the context of economic imperatives, do not make it easy to go into far afield areas where you need a lot of money that will not see any returns for many years, possibly. So that is a big limitation. But I would say, by and large, India is now coming into its own in many spheres. And I believe that this will be one in which a major contribution will be made because of the enormous amount of prior information that India can tap into. That's in itself major advantage, because I see the Western mind has been trained and programmed in such a restrictive and subjective manner that they cannot cope with a lot of things. I can see a lot of Western scientists who can't cope with the concept of extraterrestrials. They keep saying, oh, no, it's not possible. There must be something else, because how could it be? How can they fly from, even now, every day you hear lectures about how we are trying to listen to messages from the galaxy to see if somebody's sending us radio waves, because obviously they are so far away, they can't come here. They are just like a million years away from us. So, this mindset is very hard to change. And the Indians who have kept a connection with their tradition, they do not have that limitation. And in my view, that's why they are so successful in high-tech endeavors in many countries, especially English-speaking countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know one of the things that has become very popular in the United States recently are all of the whistleblowers who have come forward talking about their involvement in these alien reverse engineering projects where these crashed craft are being reverse engineered. And, there are other, and some have been saying, Stephen Greer included, that a lot of the UFOs that are seen are in fact alien reproduction vehicles. So, my question would be that I think India would by its history, its size, the nature of its military-industrial complex, have a very similar kind of classified reverse engineering programs going on. So, my question would be, how many of the UFOs that are seen today in modern India are actually reverse engineered craft built by India's secret space program?
I am very skeptical about that because honestly, why would India spend so much money building jet fighters or buying them from France, from Russia, and now perhaps from the United States? Why would they do that if they could manufacture this kind of craft? I have a question and a sort of a logical quandary about what is being said, because then, the US is still building these antiquated jets, and we don't see any tangible use of this immensely advanced technology in areas where the US could draw great benefits from using them, such as Ukraine, for example, and before that, either Iraq or, basically, if you have that kind of technology that would enable you to win a war, hands down, why would you drag it on forever and in the end lose and go home? Now, I understand there are financial interests in keeping things going and spending the money and not doing anything much about winning the war, but it still looks very hard to believe. Likewise, when you see all those dogfights and all those pilots who encounter UFOs and who don't know what they are, you have to assume that there is a huge organization working outside the US government, but which the US government does not know about, at least most people don't. And then how does that organization function on the planet? It has to be, if it exists, it has to be a hybrid alien-guided system, which is now operating outside Earth, perhaps from the Moon or Mars, and coming down here. But it certainly could not easily function on the planet without being somehow identified by the many governments in the world. And why would these governments keep denying its existence if they are trying to, fight these craft and bring them down? There's a whole series of logical problems here. Stephen Greer says hundreds of those craft have been shot down by humans. But then if the aliens are getting shot down, why are they still coming? And getting killed? Because apparently there are quite a few bodies. So why don't they react? It looks like a self-defeating thing. And then, you can go on with so many questions and which have no real answer. In my view, the craft that are being shot down are probably shot down in large part by other aliens who do not want these particular aliens to come here. And this is again an episode of the fight between the Asuras and the Devas, and probably the Devas do not want the Asuras to do certain things, and the Asuras try to keep some Devas away because they have their own vested interest here. So that makes a lot more sense than claiming that our somehow a secret government is shooting down all the spacecraft that they can find for the last many years, and yet the spacecraft keep coming in large numbers and getting shot down. It really, I keep the question open, but I do not find an easy answer to it.
Yes, it is a kind of challenging question, but I would kind of tend to side with Stephen Greer on this one, that I think that there is a kind of supranational entity that coerces all governments all over the world to keep these technologies suppressed. And that supranational entity is associated with the kind of like the petroleum industry, the pharmaceutical industry. It's associated with secret societies like the Freemasons, and that they are kind of like connected to this kind of very ancient, whether you call it the Babylonian money system. Jim Mars talked about it in Rule of Secrecy. William Bramley talked about it in The Gods of Eden, that there's a very ancient control system that is here. And I would say that probably they keep these advanced technologies suppressed and only available in these classified programs, because they know if they were to be released, that not only would the world become much more difficult to control, people would be much more prosperous with free energy and genuine healing technologies, but also our consciousness would change. So I think that's why they keep these technologies suppressed. And so each government has its own secret space program, but can't reveal it to its public. That's my guess.
I am willing to accept the sort of supranational control system, but then I think it is definitely rooted, or at least established somewhere else, not on this planet, maybe with a strong presence in the South Pole and in some other areas. But I believe there is some non-human entity behind it, because I have met, as you probably have, many top people in the financial and political. I wouldn't take into account because politicians are appointed or elected to do certain things. But then when you go to the richest people and all, you realize how ignorant many of them are. And I don't think they are making this up. They are actually trying to find out what's there, and most of them have no clue and are not even interested. So, I can't believe that it's a matter of some bankers, and name them what you will, who are actually controlling all this. How would they not be detected? And clearly, most governments are completely in the dark about it. I understand that presidents may not be read into it, but who is? You can't find anybody who really is. People are still trying to make theories because they say, well, maybe this is what's happening. I don't know. And then, so I wouldn't believe that so many people could keep so many secrets and keep pretending that they don't know anything. It would be almost impossible. It's like, imagine if Napoleon in his days had spacecraft and missiles. Why would he have kept fighting the British and the Austrians and the Russians with primitive muskets and cannons? Clearly at some point he would have used that technology. And that tells me that such technologies, if they are controlled from here, if there are any humans who actually are in control, I'm not saying humans are not serving some other masters, but the masters are not from here. And I believe the nearest we can locate them is probably on the moon, because we know there is a lot going on there. And they are the ones who have used certain entities to get what they want out of this civilization. But most humans, even the most so-called powerful ones, you take George Soros, and all their mindsets are primitive, and they don't know anything about basically anything except making money and trying to get some more power into their hands.
So, Kome, where do people go if they want to get in touch with you, or they want to find out more about your work and any projects that you have that you'd like to announce to my audience?
Well, obviously, they can see my website, carpentier.com. They find quite a lot of material on YouTube, on Google, and other media, in various languages. And I would also say that one of the things that I find very interesting about this whole thing is that most of the greatest minds who have really made great advances in the understanding of the alien civilization have also been in some way exposed to the Indian and broader Far Eastern cultures. I can give you the example of George Adamski, who taught esoteric Buddhism before he saw aliens. I could give you Lane Mead, who is not as well known, but who was the first to call the aliens ethereals, because he was a teacher of Indian philosophy, and he was supposedly shown the 5 craft that were left at Edwards Air Force Base in 1954 after the meeting with President Eisenhower. And Lane Mead wrote this famous letter, and he said they come from other lokas. They are Etherians, and lokas is a Sanskrit term for a place or a planet or a plane of existence which is above ours. And by the way, loka has given the name locus in Latin, the word locus, and location. But the loka is another world, it's another universe. So we are dealing with the multiverse. And so that shows, then you have Oppenheimer, who was an avid reader of the Bhagavad Gita. And in immediate present, we have somebody I'm working with who is an Australian scientist engineer called Malcolm Bendel. And Malcolm Bendall is working now, and we are cooperating with him on building a new generation of engines, which essentially rely on the 0 point, and he has all the proof for the results. So it is, I think, now beginning to happen. And we hope that in the next few years, we will see an entire new generation of technology replace the current one.
I want to thank you, Komi, for coming on Exopolitics Today and sharing your insights and knowledge about Vedic Indian traditions and how that applies to these very interesting questions of extraterrestrial life and secret space programs.
Most welcome. It was a pleasure as always. Thank you, Michael, and thanks to the audience.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.